Welcome to the Within You podcast, an audio companion to my online learning community at www.withinuniversity.com. Together, we're going to explore the intersection of your interior life and your creative expression, wisdom teacher and spiritual companion. And I am honored to be sitting beside Andy Ward. He's a primitive potter. We're on his property at the base of the Chiricahua Mountains, and we are about to culminate a 5-day experience at his signature primitive pottery workshop that I have been participating in. And I wanted to introduce him to you and share some of his wisdom with you. Hi, Andy.
Hi, everybody.
So the first general question I have is, how did you get into replicating primitive pottery?
When I was a kid, teenager in high school, I was an art student. I took art all 4 years in high school. And at the same time, I was also really interested in the ancient people that lived in my area where I grew up in southeastern Arizona. And so I like to visit Indian ruins. I like to go out and explore some of these kind of things that are around this area. And so when I was doing that, I'd find these bits of pottery, what we call sherds, broken pieces of pottery on the ground. And I would think, how did they do that? I mean, they weren't going to the store and buying materials. They were making it from the things in nature out here. So the things to make this kind of beautiful pottery must be around here. And so I just started experimenting with clays that I found and that sort of thing. And really, the more failures I had, the more determined I was to try to figure out how to do it. Here I am, 35 years later, and I'm still trying to learn, but I have learned a lot of things over the years.
That's actually one of the things that I am fascinated by, I admire in you, is the depth of your knowledge, but also the limitless curiosity that you have. I've actually had the opportunity to sit down at the fire with you a couple of times as you were testing things and just sharing your limitless knowledge on primitive pottery. I just want to tell you thank you for allowing your creative expression to be out in the world, because it's making a difference for so many people. One of the tenets of Love Being Human is creativity, expressing yourself in some way. You had the opportunity to work with, I'd say, hundreds, if not thousands. And I know that your YouTube channel is very popular. You're the primitive potter in the YouTube space. What would you say to folks that are interested in expressing themselves this way, but are feeling hesitant about it?
You have to realize, this is what I tell people a lot of times, is you're going to crawl before you walk. You're going to walk before you run. You're not just going to start out and make, most amazing thing. And so I do teach a lot of workshops throughout the year. And a lot of times people come in, they have some mental image of the pot they're going to make, some beautiful pot they saw online. And then they get frustrated because the one they make doesn't match, what they wanted. But that's okay. Every time you fail, or every time it doesn't come out perfect, we won't call that a failure. You're learning. You're taking steps forward, just like what I was saying about myself, right? I've been trying to learn this stuff for over 30 years, and I'm still making progress. I'm still learning because there's still things to learn. And so I think a lot of people they hesitate to start because they're afraid they're not, they're going to fail. They're afraid it's not going to come out good, but you just took what you could and you kept going. And that's the way it is with a lot of things. I used to tell my kids, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. It can be daunting if you look at the big picture. But if you look at the small steps to get there, and that's the way it is with art, right? You don't start out making the Mona Lisa. You start out with finger painting and you progress forward. It's the same way with any kind of art, I think.
I agree with you. I actually want to also add that learning in community is something that personally I advocate, and I also do myself. I'm actually one of the members of your Ancient Pottery Club, and you work with us weekly on a monthly project. But that's in addition to sort of just putting your paintbrush to the pot. And that's one of the things as today in our workshop, as I was trying to replicate a design, I was saying to myself, I'm actually just practicing these strokes, lifting, laying the yucca brush, just watching the impressions that it would make. I also want to say that in addition to doing it, practicing it, you keep a pretty rigorous schedule on how much you create. And you have a great group of primitive potters that gather together weekly on monthly projects. What inspired you to create a community around that?
Well, going back to when I was a kid, in my late teens and early 20s, and I was trying to learn how to do this, and there were no resources out there. There were none. And you could go to other potters and ask, and a lot of potters are very closed about sharing their secrets. Speak, and I use air quotes when I say secrets because, it's just techniques, but they're afraid everybody's going to compete with them or something. And so I struggled. I looked up books, and there weren't a lot of books that were giving me all the information I needed. So over the years, I've compiled information from books and videos, but also from different potters and different things I just figured out on my own. And I really have a lot of empathy for that 20-year-old Andy that was trying to learn it and realized that this information should be out there. It should be shared. It should be wide. Every culture around the world made pottery in the primitive way, or just about every culture. I mean, there's some cultures that didn't make pottery, but for the most part, you can go to, Japan and China, you can go to Europe, all over the world and find different cultures that they made primitive pottery. Today, they might make beautiful wheel-thrown glazed pottery, but at some point in their past, they made this. This is everybody's heritage, no matter where your ancestors came from. Some of them made this style of pottery, and it should be wide. It should be available. It's very accessible pottery because you don't need to have a fancy studio and electric kilns. Anybody can go out and find dirt and make it. And so going back to your question, my motivation for creating the community was just to try to make this accessible to people so that the next person coming up today who's interested in learning this has the ability to learn it.
That's wonderful. One of the reasons that I actually got interested in primitive pottery is because as a young child, and when you're 5, 6, 7, or 8, I thought back to myself, what did I enjoy doing naturally without any influence from culture, without any influence from the outside world? And I remembered that I would actually go outside, play in the caliche, and make mud pies and all sorts of things. And that's what led me to primitive pottery. I know that a part of love being human is rediscovering your joy. So if you are interested in learning about pottery, I strongly encourage you to seek out Andy. He's a wonderful teacher. Andy, what other things have you found maybe hold folks back at the beginner stage? Because you do a wonderful job of walking literally step by step. So could you give us an overview of what it is to make primitive pottery, and then maybe some of your highlights or your best tips on how to keep going at it, or just dip your fingers in it if you're nervous?
I think in some cases it can be daunting to people when they get the materials that I have, right? So I have clay, what we call wild clay that I've gathered from nature. I have different pigments, different colors of clay, and different minerals that I use to decorate the pottery. And then I have all these primitive tools. I have some stone knives that I might use to cut the clay, or I have some I have gourd tools that I use to scrape and to shape the pottery. So I have all these primitive tools, and if I was just looking at entering this maybe as a craft or a hobby, then I might say, oh, where am I going to get all this stuff? Or it would cost me a lot of money or take me a lot of time to acquire all these things. And I think that's the barrier to entry. That's the part that makes it seem inaccessible, because you're like, where would I get a deer rib like you used to scrape your pottery with? Or how in the world would I fire outdoors? I live in a city. I don't have access to go build a bonfire out in my yard like you do. But in my videos, I try to point out common, ordinary, everyday things that we might have around our house or that we can easily acquire at like the hobby store in our own town. Commercial products that we can use to make it. So I think that's important, because that way it's not hard. I could say, I could try making primitive pottery just using the clay that I bought down at Michael's or Hobby Lobby. So that makes it accessible, because most, at least Americans, have access to those kinds of resources, craft stores. And so, it's not hard. It doesn't take, like I said, it doesn't take a big fancy electric wheel or a kiln. But you still have to acquire some basic resources, and that can be daunting. And I field these kind of questions all the time on my YouTube videos. Real common questions that people ask are, I live in, for example, Poland, and I have trouble, firing there because they won't let me build a fire in my yard there. There's different laws, for example, but there's always a way to do it. So there's ways you can fire with bricks in your yard, so it's contained like a barbecue fire, and it doesn't make a lot of flames and smoke. Like I said, there's commercial products, so it is easy to get started and much easier than traditional, studio pottery. And I try to address all those on my on my YouTube channel and make it accessible. That's really part of my goal.
You do a great job of just subliminally encouraging me as a beginner to just go at it even before I actually joined your community and before I joined you here on your property. One of the things that I've noticed as we've been in conversation over the last few days is that you mention your friends who are also potters. Can you tell me just generally about the broader potter community?
When I was moving forward, I told you about when I was a young man, in my 20s and 30s, I didn't know anybody else who was doing this. As far as I knew, I was the only one. It was a bit lonely, and there's nobody to really encourage you if there's no, community. And so I started going on the internet and looking around to see, if somebody else was doing this kind of thing. And so over the years, I found that there is a larger community of people that are making replicas of ancient pottery or just practicing primitive techniques in making pottery. And there's a group. It's not really an organization. It's kind of a loose affiliation of people, and they come together for an event called the Southwest Kiln Conference every year. And so around the southwestern United States, it moves around. Every year they have it in a different location. And it's really nice to kind of come together with other people that do this and share information, techniques, maybe sources. Like we might say, oh, I found this really great clay, you should try it, or people bring things that they found. Like, here's some clay I found, I want you to try it. So not only is it fun, but it's very encouraging to not realize that you're alone and to be able to share information with others. In that regard, I've also created a Facebook group and that kind of thing to kind of allow people to share information related to primitive potters. It's nice. It's nice to have, that's one of the powers, I think, of the internet is bringing these really small niche areas of interest, connecting with people all over the world who are doing it. And that's when like I said, when I first started finding people around the southwestern United States, that was very encouraging. But my YouTube channel has allowed me to connect with people worldwide, which has really blown my mind, because when I started to get on YouTube, I really thought my audience was all U.S. based. And man, there are so many people in Europe and Australia and Africa that are interested in this that it's unbelievable. South America, all over the world. India, I hear from people all the time in these places who are interested in doing it where they live. And that's really the nice thing about primitive pottery, is that all you really need is your hands and some clay. And clay exists almost anywhere in the world. It's really fun.
It is really fun. I can attest to that. And speaking of niche communities, over the last 4 days, it has been, I told my husband, David, it's been one of the funnest things I have had the opportunity to experience. It's almost unimaginable to me, because usually I'm the odd duck out if I'm looking at the ground, picking up a rock or really admiring something. But in this crew, we're all doing the same thing. We're all looking at rocks, really interested in nature. And so I just want to thank you for bringing a community like this together, because it's allowed me on something I was curious about and that I am literally obsessed about and want to bring more into the world. For me, there's a symbolism around what happens with clay and the process of collecting it. I actually did find a source near me, and then transforming it and handling it and then painting it. It becomes a part of its creator. Can you walk someone through those main steps of creating a pot if they're curious?
Sure. So assume you already have clay. The process that I use is called coil and scrape method. So there's different methods of forming a pot. You can do a pinch pot, or there's other methods like paddle and anvil. But I used coil and scrape, which was the method that the ancient people here in Southeast Arizona used to use. And so that was my inspiration. And so with coil and scrape, you start out with what's called a puki, and that's just a shallow dish. It just forms the base of the pot, because traditionally the pots here in my area were all round bottomed, because they were cooking over open fires, and it's easy to kind of level a round bottom pot, whereas a flat bottom pot's always kind of tippy over a campfire. So I start with a puki, which is a shallow dish with a rounded bottom, and I press clay into it, and then I roll out coils like long snakes of clay, and I attach those one after the other to form the shape of the pot. And then we scrape it all smooth. After that, I'm not just making, well, I'm not always. Sometimes I'm making plain pottery, but usually what I'm making is decorated pottery. So once I've got it smooth, then I might put a layer of slip on it. That's just a fine like liquidy clay that you paint on, like a layer of paint almost. And then I take different minerals and paint designs on the pot. And then the pot might be burnished. It might be polished with a stone. And then I take it out. Once it's fully dry, I take it outdoors and I fire it in like a campfire, essentially. So that's the steps to making it.
One of the fascinating experiences that I had that I want to share with everyone is we actually got to walk your property, and your property is part of a ancient ruin site. Can you tell us about the people that were here?
These people were the culture, archaeologists call the Mogollon culture. And they lived here from, I don't know, like maybe the time of Christ, maybe 100 AD, something like that, up until 1450. First, they were hunter-gatherers, and around the time of 300 or so, they started getting agriculture as it came up from Mexico, and then they acquired pottery-making skills, which also came up from Mexico. So a lot of the technology and stuff was coming north out of Mexico. They were living in what they call a pit house, which was kind of a more rudimentary and dug into the ground, and then later they were building like adobe pueblos. So their culture evolved over the course of 1,000 years or so. And the ruins that I have here on my property, they're at the later end of that period. So they would be maybe mid 1300s. So they disappeared around 1450. So this would be right towards the end of that period. And so here on my property, I have 40 acres. There's a ruin that's maybe 15 acres in size. And there's a variety of these one-story adobe pueblos there. And if you look around on the ground, it's covered with these sherds of pottery, these broken bits of pottery. Some of them are plain, some of them are decorated, and there's other things. We found some bits of beads this weekend, and sometimes you see arrowheads, metates, different things. And then around 1450, these people all packed up and left the area. So nobody really knows what happened, but that's the story.
That's fascinating. Now, you talked about the evolution of those people over a period of time. You've been interested in and had your hands in clay for 35 years. So as you think forward a little bit, how do you see this as an artistic expression evolving? Are you sensing something in the future that maybe will impact it?
Not for me personally, I don't think. I'm just hoping to improve in my skills. Like I said, I'm still learning. So to me, the real fun isn't trying to grow my art, like, changing it in some way, but to look at the ancient pottery and get clues about how they made it and see what I can learn from it. And so not only do I look at the broken bits of pottery here on my property, but I also talk to a lot of archaeologists. So archaeologists are always looking at these sherds and studying them with, different tests, looking at them under microscopes. They'll actually make what they call a thin section. They will make a microscopically thin slice of a pottery sherd, so thin that light can pass through it. And then they look at it under a strong microscope, and they can tell the different minerals that are in the clay, the materials that made the clay. And by doing that, they can tell where the pot was made. And they do other tests to find out, what temperature the pot was fired at, or the different minerals that were used to decorate it. And so my goal is to come to a better understanding of the ancient people through my art. So my goal is just to try to understand better and try to make better pottery based on what I'm learning from what the ancient people did.
That's beautiful. And the other side of that coin for me, and I think for my community of listeners, is understanding something on the outside that then sort of flips and helps us understand ourselves more. Because I've even noticed, as I said earlier, there's internal work for me as I'm learning the paint stroke, the brush stroke, that I'm looking at it as a practice, which I encourage everyone to do, is take on a practice. One of the things that we've had the opportunity to do, Andy, and we really want to thank you for it, is that we've been primitive camping here on the property during the workshop, and having the opportunity to fall asleep under the stars, to wake up to the sunrise. I mean, I know that nature is a very important part of your life. Can you tell us more about that? Because one, it's the kind of a dream come true, because Andy happens to have a property across the street from the Tucson Amateur Astronomers Club. The stars aligned for us because there was a star party yesterday. Also, having an opportunity to be out in nature and to learn about it by experiencing it is important. How do you feel about nature?
I've taught over the years, I've taught a lot of workshops in city, in Tucson, in the Phoenix area. It's nice because it's easy to fill a workshop in Phoenix, for example. They just fill up because people don't have to get hotel rooms. They don't have to camp. They can go home and sleep in their own bed. So it's very convenient for people. One of the things I try to do in my workshops is I want people to kind of understand how the ancient people lived and worked. And it's really hard to imagine that when you're in the middle of Phoenix or Tucson. But out here, it's real easy to imagine it because this is what it was like where they lived. They dealt with nature every day, or the weather. Like when we first got here, there were a couple of cold nights. That's what life was like for them, for example. Or if the wind's blowing really strong and it's drawing your pottery out, well, that's something they faced every day when they were making pottery. So I think nature is a big part of primitive pottery, not only because we go out and gather the materials from nature. It impacted how they made their pottery and it impacted their whole life. So, I mean, to me, having the workshop out here is wonderful because you're more in touch with primitive skills and the primitive materials that you're collecting. And we've gone all over the valley this week. We've been about 3 different locations to collect clay, and we went over to some old mines and collected minerals for making paints, stopped and collected some leaves to make paintbrushes out of. And so that's all engaging in different aspects of nature in this vicinity that the ancient people would have used in all kinds of different ways, not just for pottery. For example, the yucca leaves we collected might also have been used to make rope or strings, right? It might also have been used to weave baskets. The clay that we use might have been used to make pottery, but was also used to build their houses, their adobe houses, or to make their fire hearths, all kinds of things. So these materials that come from nature were very important to them. And so I think it's good. I think it's good for people today to reconnect a little bit with that past that really was all of our ancestors, not, in the big scheme of things, not that long ago.
That's a very good point. No, it's been a priceless experience, Andy. What would you like to share?
It's nice to have people come out and care about making pottery this way because it's something that's important to me. And I enjoy teaching others, but I teach others every day in my YouTube. I try to make a video every week. So teaching others is something I do often, but you don't get the same connection with the students making YouTube videos. It's really great to come out here and connect one-on-one with the students in this way. So it's really a joy, and it's nice to see people like Vivian that care so much about it.
Thank you. One of the things that's fascinating to me about making pottery in this way is that the variables change all the time. To have a certain frame of mind in order to sort of not go crazy at it, not coming out perfect every time. What would you say to folks that are used to modern recipe to things and how that compares to what you're doing with primitive replicating?
We're used to products that come out of factories and everything's perfect and everything's the same. And that's not how things were in the past. We have to understand that it's okay if your pot doesn't come out perfectly round, for example, or the surface isn't perfectly smooth. And then there's the breakage. Sometimes pots made this way will break. They'll crack while they dry, or something goes wrong in the firing and they explode. There's a lot more chance that things are going to go wrong in your pot. Something's going to go wrong. Last year I made a big beautiful pot, and it broke in the firing, and I caught it on film, and everybody saw it and said, "Oh, I cried when I saw that video," But that's a great lesson because things don't always turn out right, and you have to move forward and try to learn from the experience. I think it's really good to try to get out of that modern mindset of everything has to be perfect or everything has to come out the way I expected, and realize that out here in nature, man, it's like being a farmer, right? The farmer puts his seeds in the ground, and then what if the rains don't come, or what if an early frost comes? That's just life when you're dealing with nature every day.
That's true. We can't predict nature, and we have to be prepared. But I do love the challenge of adjusting to what's right in front of you, which is much different than, like you said, than the manufactured products that we're used to. If someone's interested in learning more about you and what you do, where would you ask them to go find out more information?
My website, ancientpottery.how. I have online classes on there. I have the Ancient Potters Club that you mentioned earlier, which is our Wednesday night Zoom class. Basic information. There's articles you can read, and there's videos, and there's a newsletter you can sign up for. So that'd be a great place to start.
That's wonderful. Well, pottery for me is allowing me to connect to nature and also to connect with myself and to do something that I advocate for everyone to do, and that is to have a creative expression that you do for the joy of it. Is there any final words or motivation, maybe some inspiration for folks that are feeling like they aren't creative or can't make these kinds of things?
Well, you can. You absolutely can. And like I said, the first one you make is probably not going to be your greatest work. But like I was telling Vivian on our first day of the class, I said she was making her second piece, and I said, look at how much better you're doing on the second one than the first one. It's amazing how it's always the first morning. People, when they make the first pot, they struggle and they get frustrated, and you can see it on their faces. And there's really not much I can do for them. I mean, I can tell them, I can show them, I can demonstrate. But in the end, they've got to put their hands on the clay and they've got to kind of come to grips with it. But they learn so fast, like they kind of get a feel for the clay. And by the time they're making their second pot, it's light years ahead of where they were just an hour before. When you realize that when you do something like this, yeah, your first attempt, you're gonna struggle, but you'll make progress. You'll make progress quickly. And to me, my inspiration, if you like a Google image search and you just look for prehistoric Southwest pottery, or, if you pick a specific type like Tularosa black on white pottery, and all these hundreds of these ancient pots come up, suddenly I'm motivated, I'm inspired, and I'm like, yeah, that's what I want to do, because that's always what's inspired me is the pots. So if you want to get some inspiration, you can go there and, look up some pictures, and that might motivate you to get started.
Andy has probably thousands of hours of YouTube videos. Watch them until you feel comfortable. Any final words, Andy?
Really appreciate you coming out, and I appreciate getting the opportunity to talk to your audience.
Well, you've been listening to the Within You podcast with Vivi and Andy Ward here. And in closing, if you're interested in building your inner skills as you move through your own transformational change, I invite you to schedule a conversation with me at viviancarrasco.as.me. That's VIVIANCARRASCO.as.me, and we can have a conversation